It's the middle of July, and my month has been filled with poisoned planets, family curses, and space military getting in fights with cosmic gods. Welcome to the depths. Hello, welcome or welcome back to Reading from the Depths. My name is Lecton. Thanks for spending some time with me today. So today, it is the middle of July, and I wanted to have a little discussion about what I have been up to the first half of this month and what I've been reading for the first half of July. So just mid-month check-in. First, July 1st was my BookTube anniversary, my 1-year anniversary, and I had a really long, probably annoyingly long AMA video. And I want to again thank everyone who asked questions and everyone who's watched that video and everyone who has welcomed me into this community over the past year. So again, thank you for that. And that video is available if anyone wants to torture themselves with an hour of my nonsense rambling. I also wanted to say that this month, the beginning of July was the 90th birthday of His Holiness the Dalai Lama, and so because of that, I had a number of celebrations and pujas, prayer festivals that I was involved in, but also because of that, my monastery had a little bit of a holiday, and so the first 2 weeks have been much more relaxed than usual, and so I've gotten a decent amount of reading in, and I think I have about a day and a half more of it being relaxed, and then things are going to amp up quite a bit, and our schedule looks quite hectic over the next month, but the last 2 weeks have been quite relaxed, and so I'm appreciative of that, but we'll see how things change, of course, with the next month going forward. Now, the last thing I want to talk about is, over the last 2 weeks, in my particular corner of BookTube, there has been what people are referring to as some drama. And, I haven't said anything publicly about this. I haven't made any videos or even commented on any other people's videos, and for a few reasons. The first is, I found out about this because the person involved contacted me directly. And so I has had direct conversation with him about it. And I've been talking with him since then. And that felt like the most productive way for me to be involved was directly like that. Also, my impulse is if I were to become involved in a public way, it often feels like I'm centering myself in something that isn't about me. And I'm not projecting that on anyone else necessarily, but that is often something that it feels like for me to step into something like this. And I mean, I will project it on others. I definitely saw some videos and responses from people who didn't see any of the original videos in question, didn't even know any of the creators in question, but had heard about the drama from like secondary or tertiary sources and then use it as a stepping stone for them to make their own rant and their own video. And so those did exist. I saw those. And then I saw other videos which were incredibly compassionate and considerate and well thought out, and I think constructive and useful for the community. So I definitely saw a whole range, and I just didn't feel like adding my voice to the conversation was necessary. And of course, I know that I'm doing that now a little bit, so that's a little bit contradictory, but I thought it'd be useful to just say something now that most of the rigmarole has died down at least a little bit. The one thing I will say is, I always try to bring whatever is going on in my life to my reading, and there were 2 books I read during the first half of the month that directly brought up ideas related to the situation. And the first one, the beginning of the story has a character, our main character, who is a police officer, who is arresting someone, but the way he goes about it, he's acting out of pure anger and fear, I suppose. And he's not following common sense. He's not following protocol. He's not even following his gut. He is following his anger and not seeking justice, but seeking retribution. And as a result of that, that starts a cascade of really awful events. And he spends the rest of the story trying to make up for those events that he began because he acted out of anger. Right? Not out of a compassionate outrage seeking actual justice, but out of an anger that sought to harm the person who had caused pain to others. So that was one thing I was thinking about. The other thing was in another novel, there is a character who in the beginning of his life experiences a really horrific, violent mob. And then later in his life, a friend of his is looking to start some sort of revolutionary liberatory action. And it doesn't happen right away, but he is thinking about it when it didn't occur the way it had been planned, and he is glad that it didn't happen. And the reason is he's thinking about the mob and how, regardless of your intentions, once a group of individuals who are committed to social justice is rallied up, it can transform into a mob quite easily, and there is some sort of dividing line. And a mob, once you have a mob, regardless of the original motivation or intention, it is hard to, as he puts it in the novel, the mob itself, it's hard to hold them back from the barbaric violence that they strain for, right? Because that's how mobs work. They don't seek out constructive dialogue or community building, they seek out destruction. And so those two things were on my mind. I mean, or rather, as I read those novels, those two things popped out of me in relationship to this quote unquote drama that has been happening in this corner of BookTube. And what I want to say is, I find that I'm really grateful for this neighborhood of BookTube that I find myself in. That of all the responses that I saw, both in comments and in videos, whether they were the most skillful responses or not, none of them that I saw seemed to be motivated by anger. They didn't seem to want to punish the person who had caused harm, but instead they seemed like they wanted to bring about restitution for the person who was harmed, right? So instead of acting out of a destructive anger, they were acting out of what I would call a compassionate outrage, right? A seek to redress harm at any level. And that was just heartwarming. It was heartwarming to realize that this little corner of YouTube or BookTube or whatever you want to say that I find myself in is populated with other individuals who are acting in ways that make me feel good to be part of that community, right? So that, I think, is all I have to say on it, that it was unfortunate this happened. And I think having happened the way it did, I think the outcome, actually the outcome is not that important to me, but the means of redress that brought about the outcome were the best I think I could have hoped for. And so I'm appreciative of that and the community that I find myself in. So that is all I have to say about that. From there, let's talk about the books that I have read in the past 2 weeks. As I said, it has been a very relaxed kind of 2 weeks. So I finished 12 titles, which is a lot. And I'm going to do my best to go through them quickly. If you have seen any of my other videos, you will know that I'm bad at doing that. So I'm going to do my best. Some of them I might jump over really, really quickly. Anyway, let's go. First book, this is one I was reading at the end of last month, Fool's Errand by Robin Hobb. This is the first book in the Tawny Man trilogy, the 7th book in the realm of the Elderling saga. So this, after the Liveship Traders trilogy, which is full of very fast action and multiple points of view, we return to first-person retrospective narration following Fitz. We get back to Fitz in his life, and it was great. It is such a change of pace. You know, literally the first 200 pages of this book, nothing happens. The epilogue of the last time we saw Fitz, which was the 3rd book of the Farthest trilogy, that epilogue that says basically what happened to him after he finished his quest and he began writing his adventures and having these recollections, that small epilogue is basically expanded into the first 200 pages of this book. So literally nothing happens. We're just told about what's been happening in the intervening years. And then he goes on a quest, and I loved it. It was great. It was slow. It was contemplative. It was intimate. It was all the things that Robin Hobb does really well. She expanded the world even more, even though we've had such an expansive world through the Farthest trilogy and the Liveship Traders trilogy. She went deeper into the sociological strata within the world, and she investigated new parts of the 6 duchies that we hadn't been to before. So she managed to expand the world, and she also managed to take the 2 types of magic, right? So we know there's 2 types of magic in this world. One is called the wit, and that is an earthier magic. It's more emotional. It has a connection to nature and to animals. And then there is the skill, which is a more psychological magic, right? So it's like the difference between heart and brains. And our main character Fitz, he has both those types of magic. And that was a big part of the first trilogy, of the Farsight trilogy. Those both play a role in this story as well. Importantly, because the wit is looked down upon. And that was the case in the first trilogy, but it's been amped up. So it's at a point where anyone that is witted, they get called out into the street and get murdered by large crowds of people without any punishment, right? Without any repercussions. And so if you're witted, you have to hide it. And so he's back at a place where he has to hide who he is, yet he is reliant upon those skills and the combination of those 2 types of magic to go on this quest. And the quest in this one is that the prince has gone missing. So he has to return to his old life. He has to go back to the main town, to the castle, where they all think he's dead. So he can't be himself. He has to adopt a new identity, and he is asked to go on this quest to try to rescue the prince who has gone missing. And so he, as always, Robin Hobb has this really gentle hand. Like I said, it's really slow, it's really contemplative, it takes a long time to go anywhere, but when it does, you're really invested. So I really loved it. It's, like I said, the first book in the Tawny Man trilogy. The second book is going to be on my immediate TBR, so I was very happy with that. The next book that I want to talk about is Cage of Souls by Adrian Tchaikovsky. And this one I will not talk a lot about now because I have a full review coming up, I think next week. I'm not quite sure, depending on when this video airs. But this is wildly different than other books I've read by Adrian Tchaikovsky. And this is written first-person retrospective as well, which I have not really seen from him before. The pacing is much more contemplative and much slower. And this is a Dying Earth novel. So the Dying Earth subgenre being one that looks at a future where either the Earth is dying or dead, or life on Earth as we know it is on its way out. And as a subgenre of speculative fiction or eco-fiction, it tends to be bleak and weary, and it isn't infused with the kind of optimism that I've come to expect in a lot of Adrian Tchaikovsky's work, and that is the case here. Like, this is a bleak novel, but I loved it. It was so great. It has been scratching at my brain ever since I finished it, and so I'll have more to say about this in a full review coming up. The next book I want to talk about is an arc that I read, and this is called The Bewitching by Silvia Moreno Garcia. And I have to say, I didn't love this as much as I wanted to. You know, Silvia Moreno Garcia has become very popular with her novel Mexican Gothic, and she also wrote Silver Nitrate. And what I have loved about her work in the past is her ability to not only create really interesting characters, but then put them in relationships with other characters that is additive, right? And it makes it more interesting and exciting, the way the characters work together and develop as a community, or as more than as a relationship, right? And that really doesn't happen in this novel. And even though it has interesting ideas, the characters themselves are interesting, but they are almost always in isolation. So the story follows 3 different time periods. Our main story follows a young woman who is Mexican, but she is doing graduate studies in English literature in Eastern Massachusetts. And it takes place in the 1990s. And then the secondary story is her great-grandmother in Mexico, so at the turn of the century. And then the middle story is a transcript that she has found that takes place in the middle of the 1900s. That is a transcript written by the author who she's studying for her master's degree. And so you have these 3 stories. And one takes place at the turn of the 20th century in Mexico, and the one takes place in the middle of the 20th century in Massachusetts, and then the third story takes place at the end of the 20th century in Massachusetts. And my problem was that these stories, they feel like the same story, but told 3 different ways. So they don't feel like they're adding anything to each other. If you're going to take a story and a novel and write it in 3 different time periods, I want those 3 stories to be additive. I want them to add up to something that is more robust than the individual parts, and it didn't feel that way. And in addition, the writing of the 3 different stories felt the same. And if you're writing one story that takes place in, early 20th century Mexico, and one that takes place in the 1990s in, Eastern Massachusetts, I want the writing to feel different. I want it to have a different sense of place. The description of the world was different, right? And the description of the types of characters that populated their worlds were different, but the writing still felt the same. So I didn't really feel a strong distinction between these 3 sections, and these 3 sections didn't add together to make something bigger than the sum of the parts. And so that was a little bit disappointing. It wasn't a bad book. The writing was strong. The writing was competent. It's about being cursed by a witch, basically, and this idea of a family curse, and if a curse can move across generations and across time and across space. I liked the way traditional Mexican folklore is taking place in New England. I thought that was fun. Instead of relying on, a Puritan folklore or even Native American folklore, the idea of native Mexican folklore being transplanted to New England, I thought was interesting. I just didn't think the story capitalized on it in a way that was fulfilling, emotionally fulfilling. So it wasn't a bad story. If I had to rate it, I gave it 3 stars, I think, but it didn't do for me the things that I wanted it to do. And I think in big part that's because the characters all kind of exist in isolation, and I would have liked to see more characters. I mean, even the ancillary characters were fun. I liked spending time with them, but whenever they came into the scene, they were there for a short period and they disappeared. I would have liked to see more handoff between characters and more of that relationship building. So it might be interesting to you if you like witchcraft stories, if you like folklore, if you like, folk horror stories that take place in multiple time periods, especially, then, it's not a bad book. It just was a little bit disappointing and not what I was hoping for it to be. The next novel I want to talk about is actually a middle grade horror story. This is called The Clackity by Laura Senf. I won't talk much about this. I think there are 3 books in this series. It's called the Blight Harbor trilogy. I think I'm going to read all 3. I'm reading them. I don't really have a strong affection for middle grade horror. It doesn't do a lot for me, but I'm reading these specifically because I want to see if they would be good to share with my nibblings, who I'm always trying to, I buy books for them all the time, and it's hard to find good horror stories for that age range. And so I heard the author speak about these, and I've heard them highly praised, so that's why I'm reading them. And I thought this one was great. The simple premise is it follows a 12-year-old girl who lives in Blight Harbor. That's the name of the town. She lives with her aunt. Now, Blight Harbor is the 7th most haunted place in America per capita, as she reminds us. And the reason she lives with her aunt is because when she was 8, so 4 years before the story takes place, her house burned down and both of her parents disappeared and were declared dead, even though their bodies weren't found. And so what I really loved about the story is her depiction as a character. Like, she is given the room to be this messy 12-year-old. She has panic attacks. And she talks about like what a panic attack feels like and how she goes about trying to get out of a panic attack or preventing it from happening. She has severe separation anxiety. And those are explored in a holistic way that I think is really refreshing to see for this age group. And yeah, I enjoyed the book. I had some problems with the plot, but I don't know if they were like legitimate problems or just like I had expectations of middle grade stories that maybe were out of sync with what they are. So I'm going to read the other two, and then I'll get back to you when I've read all 3 of them. The next book that I finished was a collection of short stories that I had been meaning to read for quite a while. This is called In the Mad Mountains, Stories Inspired by H.P. Lovecraft. This is by Joe Lansdale. And this is a collection of stories. There aren't new stories. I think the newest one is from maybe 2015. But these are a bunch of stories that deal with eldritch gods and with cosmic horror that he's pulled together into this single collection. And I thought it was great. I thought it was a lot of fun. It's only 8 stories, so they're pretty long. They're more like novelettes than short stories. One of them is a retelling of Huck Finn, or not a retelling of Huck Finn rather, but it takes place after the events of the novel of Huck Finn, and it follows Huck and Jim, as he is referenced in this, and they happen to meet, some eldritch gods that cause a ruckus. And a couple of them are retellings of stories that you've already heard, but he brings in this eldritch deity and this kind of cosmic horror, and I thought it was a lot of fun. I'd heard Lansdale talking with Lloyd Barron actually on a podcast, and they're talking about cosmic horror and what they feel about Lovecraft. And I started a big Lovecraft project at the end of last year. I have the omnibus of all of his stories, and I wanted to just read all of them because I'd only read a few of them here and there, and I read about 15 or so, and I had to put it down because I don't love Lovecraft's writing. I like his ideas, but a lot of his writing rather just feels, I don't know. Anyway, it's not my favorite, so I'm working through that myself. And I was inspired because Lansdale says the exact same thing. He and Lloyd Barron both. I had read another collection of short stories by Lloyd Barron that came out this year, I believe, or maybe at the end of 2024, called Not a Speck of Light, and that has some fantastic cosmic horror, like really weird fantasy, dark horror in that collection as well. And the two of them were in conversation about it, and they both kind of agreed that they love the ideas and the mythologies that Lovecraft is able to create and to the atmosphere he's able to create with it, but they don't like his writing style, and they don't like the mechanics of his prose. Don't do it for them. So I appreciated his stories. I will say though, they're inspired by Lovecraft very much, insofar as they take eldritch deities and these, the mythology of all these different gods, and they're infused into the stories. But cosmic horror as a genre tends to be really cynical and really nihilistic almost, because part of the idea of cosmic horror is that humans exist as less than ants to this realm of gods, and these gods, like, there is an inevitability to our demise because nothing is worth anything in the face of these horrors that exist. And so there's always this like overwhelming nihilism, really, and this darkness and an inevitability about cosmic horror. And that isn't really the tone that a lot of these stories go for. So they just invoke the imagery of these cosmic gods without always having the weight of cosmic horror in general. And I thought it was a fun collection. So if those kind of things interest you, I do recommend it. I think Lansdale's writing is great. And he has another collection coming up being published later in the year. That's like a best of Joe Lansdale's horror short stories or something like this. And I have an arc of it. And I wanted to make sure I'd read this before I got into that arc. And so that will be coming up in the next months. Moving on from there, I have a nonfiction book I read, and this is Abundance by Ezra Klein and Derek Thompson. And, if I listen to Ezra Klein writes for the New York Times, and he has a podcast that he does for the New York Times. And so if you listen to him like I do, then there isn't really anything new in this story. Ezra Klein's politics are relatively liberal. I think they're probably as liberal as you could get and still be employed with the New York Times, right? So not as progressive as me, but in general, they're politics that I mostly agree with, and I enjoy. He's a really smart thinker. he's looking at the Democratic Party and the way it basically has shot itself in the foot by overregulating things throughout the last few decades. And the best intentions with which the Democratic Party creates regulations and ideas then go by the wayside when those same regulations are used to restrict progress. And so he's looking at housing, especially in California, and the inability to ever build low-income housing, because in order to build housing or have housing funded by the state, it has to meet certain ecological concerns, and it has to meet certain concerns regarding how many contracts are done and how many, what kind of inclusion it has, and all these different restriction upon restriction upon restriction is added, and they're all done with the best of intentions, but the result is nothing ever gets done. And so that is kind of what he's looking at, how we have created policies that seem like they're done for the best interest of people, but then really just result in nothing ever happening and creating a stagnancy, which makes the Democratic Party entirely ineffectual to create any change that's useful or that is felt by the people that they are claiming to work for. And it's a compelling argument. I don't agree with everything he says. He's not just supporting this idea of complete deregulation, but that is kind of the logical outcome of where he's going. And that is then, again, he's putting the onus on the affected parties and not really holding responsible the people that are creating the harm to some extent. It's still very thought-provoking. It's also kind of depressing because he doesn't really offer a lot of great solutions. The problem is that even if his diagnosis is correct, the only way to create some sort of remedy for what he has diagnosed as the problem would involve a type of political will that doesn't exist in either party, and it would need to exist within both parties. So the book itself, I think, is a really interesting look at some of the failures of the Democratic Party, and it offers points of insight about if we want to create a framework for change in the future and to create a platform that is really inclusive and that is actually engaging in work on the ground and not just conceptual work, and a platform of social politics that is looking to actually help people in tangible physical ways instead of just talking about it, and instead of creating regulation to stop bad things from happening, to create a proscriptive type of action where you're actually creating things, right, instead of just stopping things, then it's useful to help create that framework or to help get people thinking about useful frameworks of social engagement. It's not prescriptive. It doesn't offer actual actionable ideas in the immediate future, but it does offer a vision of what it could look like to have at least a party, if not a whole government, that is simultaneously trying to hold back the dangers of bad actors, while simultaneously actually doing the work to build infrastructure, whether it be in transportation or in housing or in science or in any of these other fields, building things, like making things tangibly better for the people that need those benefits. So he is at least, I say he, it's really the two of them. They are at least providing an image or an idea of what a politics of abundance could look like, even if they don't have a clear roadmap of how we can actually get there from here. So in that regard, I guess there is some hope or optimism in it, but it is a little bit of a downer because it just seems so far away. Like, it doesn't seem actionable in any immediate way. And if you have listened to his podcast over the past year, you've probably heard a lot of these things already because they're things that he talks about. But anyway, if you haven't heard his podcast, or the idea of learning how the Democratic Party has continually, tied both of its hands behind his back over the last few decades, then this will give you some insights into that. The next book I want to talk about is The Farthest Shore. So that is the third story in the Earth-Sea cycle by Ursula K. Le Guin. I had read the first two last month, and so I just finished the third one, The Farthest Shore, and I'm going to be reading the fourth one very shortly, and then hopefully the next two. It's a 6-book cycle, so hopefully the next two will be coming soon. I've been reading these both audiobook and in paper book at the same time. It's kind of my first experience doing immersive reading like that. I've been enjoying it. These are YA fantasy novels written in late 60s, early 70s, and I think they're great. I think what's really wonderful about them is that in the very first one, our main character is a character named Ged, but in the very first one, we start with talking about the Song of Ged and like these tales of Ged. So you already have created this epic history, right? So then when we actually get to his story, we know that it is a glorious story that is so amazing that there are stories told about it in the far future. And so she's created this epic landscape that is really, really wonderfully populated by caring and emotional characters. And in the first book, he's a young boy who's finding out that he has magic. And the second book is a number of years later, and he is actually pose as the antagonist, at least for the first half of the book, which is really interesting. Now in this third book, he is an adult. He's an old man. He is the Archmage. He is the Dragon Whisperer. He has accomplished all these things that you don't ever see him accomplish. You just know that he accomplished them. Yet magic is disappearing from the world, and so he has to go on a quest to try to find out why magic is disappearing. And I thought it was great. I think the way it moves through time is really wonderful, is really gentle. I think the magic systems that she employs are really innovative, especially for the time. And everything about it, I think, is really, really thoughtful and wonderful. The one thing that irked me a little bit in this story is they talk about how in the beginning, they talk about the fact that there's no longer a king of Earthsea. There's a bunch of different provinces and local governments and so forth. And some of them are ruled by kings, some are ruled by democratic leaders or whatnot. But there used to be, in time immemorial, a single king that ruled all of Earthsea. And there is this idea that if there was a single king again, then that would create a unified land that would be beneficial, and it would stop some of the harm that was happening. And that is like a common trope, right? This benevolent dictator idea. And it just surprised me. Within the story, it was perfectly fine. It made sense within the story, within the world. But, Ursula K. Le Guin is an anarchist. And the idea of having that a benevolent dictator can ever create an environment where individuals prosper and grow is totally anathema to her politics. And so it was just weird having the characters believe that. And I'm wondering if in the remaining books, that idea is going to be turned on its head. I really kind of hope it is, because it doesn't seem like the kind of, political message that I see in her other books. And so a lot of her work, even these YA books, there is a subversive quality to them where they are promoting ideas that are, I don't want to say against the status quo, but they are outside of normal mainstream politics. And she's not doing it in a heavy-handed way. Like, these aren't political books, right? The Earthsea books, at least. Some of her sci-fi, adult sci-fi, is much more explicitly political. These aren't. Yet they do have these ideas that push against the boundaries of what is expected. And so just the idea of lamenting the loss of this benevolent dictator ruling all of the world, it just seems out of character for her as an author. So we'll see where that goes the next books. But I did really enjoy this, and I look forward to continuing in the series. The next book I read is a reread for me, and that is The Outsider by Stephen King. This came out in 2018, I believe, and it is often considered the first book in the Holly Gibney series. And I just finished the new Holly Gibney book, Never Flinch, and I didn't really love it very much. And I remembered that The Outsider was my favorite of the Holly Gibney books, so I wanted to see if that still held true, and it does. It is a great book. I had forgotten that Holly doesn't show up until the halfway point. I knew she's not the main character. The main character is a detective named Ralph Anderson, and she gets consulted, and so she comes in. But I thought she came in a lot earlier. But no, I was wrong. She comes in halfway. Yet, when she does come in, she steals the scenes, right? She is phenomenal. And the story itself, it just is King firing on all cylinders. Everything he does in this is good. The mystery elements, the cop elements, the investigative elements, the supernatural elements, the emotional elements. It's actually King putting everything together in a way that is him showing off what he's really good at. And so I really loved it. I think it's a great, great novel. I really did appreciate, even in here, seeing how she's changed from the events of the Bill Hodges trilogy, and how she has had to come into her own in a way that she didn't want to, and that she didn't expect to have to do. But you can see this budding character who is really forced to grow in ways that she grew throughout the whole Bill Hodges trilogy, but this is her on her own for the first time, really, and it's wonderful. It's delightful. So I really enjoyed the reread. I'm really glad that I did it. Now, the next novel I read, this I read on audiobook. This is NecroTek by Jonathan Mayberry. This was suggested to me by Libby, so I said, hey, Libby, why not? And, this was wild. So Jonathan Mayberry, he's the current editor of Weird Tales magazine, and he's written a number of horror novels and sci-fi novels, and he's won a number of awards, some of them YA, some of them adult. So he's a very prominent author. This novel is wild. It takes place in the near future, I think like 2170. And so we have some quite advanced technology, but other than that, it is, very much situated in our understanding of the world. And they reference Lovecraft specifically, but other cultural touchstones of the 21st century, 20th and 21st century. So it ties itself to our living history. And the premise of it is it starts at a space station outside of Jupiter, and they have developed teleportation technology, or they believe they have. And it's a test. It's the final test for this teleportation technology. So there are all these people in attendance to see this test. And our main character is actually a cosmic philosopher or a cosmic theologian. And he is there with a whole group of different faith leaders from all different faiths, including one faith that is an ancient faith that you find out has been existing in the shadows of world history that are all about necromancy, which will come in later. But the reason being that as we expand our understanding of the world and we expand into the stars more and more and more, traditional faiths are being tested, especially ideas of creator gods that have Earth as the center of their world system are being tested as we find proof of the infinity of space, right? So he is on as part of this test with a whole group of faith leaders, which is an interesting angle into the story. And the other main character is basically a fighter pilot that we meet. The story moves across different perspectives, but those are the two that we are anchored in. And needless to say, this teleportation test, they're not teleporting people, they're teleporting matter, and it's supposed to be teleported from one side of Jupiter to the other, basically. And it goes wrong, as you can imagine. And they find themselves having gone through some trans-dimensional weirdness 53,000 light years away from from Earth, which is bad. Like, that's not a good place to be, being 53,000 light years away from home and not having anybody to go back. Yeah, that's a bad thing. It gets worse when you start being attacked by eldritch gods. And so the premise here is that all of the eldritch gods who are thought of, who were inspired, or rather who were explained or described in Lovecraftian mythos, really exist. And Lovecraft was inspired because the eldritch gods, which are the lesser of the three levels of gods, including Cthulhu and others, escaped to Earth and went into deep slumber to hide from the other gods that were hunting them. And in their deep slumber, they inspired people like Lovecraft, who was essentially like a prophet. And so everything Lovecraft taught about the eldritch gods is true. That is like the premise. And now we are fighting them. But then you find out there are other groups of aliens, obviously, who have been fighting them and who have died, millions of times. Whole planets have been extinguished. But there's one planet who has existing technology, and in order for that technology to work, there is alien AI that runs these ships, but it has to be merged with a soul, and it has to be a dead soul. So people have to die, and then their souls have to be resurrected and joined with this AI, and that's where this idea of NecroTek, right? Necromancy and technology combined. So you have these ships that are piloted by the resurrected souls of dead fighter pilots, combining with alien AI to battle eldritch gods, which is wild, right? And this story does. It feels like you've just taken a little bit of everything and mixed it all together, yet it works. The story is centered in people and in emotions. It is centered in characters that are like meaningful and have like important relationships with one another that you care about. Like, you actually care about these characters, and the battles are really well written. They're really exciting. They're really dynamic. And yes, it is out there. It is wild. It's like I said, it's like a potpourri, like pulling a little bit of everything together, yet it feels cohesive. And it's fun. At the end of the day, it is a lot of fun. It was a joy to read. There's a new book coming out the end of this year that is, I don't know, I don't think it's following our main characters directly. I think it's set in the same world. I'm not quite sure, but I'm definitely going to pick it up because I had a lot of fun with this. The next book I read was a buddy read. This was a buddy read with my friend Alex, and it is The Case Against Satan by Ray Russell. Now, this is possibly the first contemporary Exorcist-based fiction. And this was written in 1962, so 7 or 8 years before The Exorcist. And Alex loves The Exorcist, the novel, and I very much dislike it. I think it is not good. I like the film quite a lot, which was written, the screenplay was written by the author of the novel, but I just think the writing in the novel is quite clunky. And so we went into this having very different opinions of The Exorcist, which is clearly born from this. And we both loved this. And I mean, I'll let him speak for himself. I thought it was great. The first 2 chapters, the writing was really weird. Like, the writing style changed when you got to the 3rd chapter. The first 2 chapters, it felt like almost an MC narrating a play. It was very, very strange. But then it fell into a more natural rhythm. And, it wasn't perfect. And some of the writing was weird throughout. But the story, I thought, was wonderful. And it doesn't have the spectacle that you see in The Exorcism. It's really about the psychology of the characters. And what I really enjoyed about it is often you see in almost all exorcists or exorcism kind of based pop culture, you're going to have 2 priests, because it's always Catholic priests. They're the only ones that can exorcise anything. You have 2 priests, and one of them is doubting his faith. and the other one is convinced of his faith, and through the act of exercising, usually this young girl, the one who's doubting his faith comes back to believe in his faith. And usually the elder priest is going to die. Like, that is how these things go. Here, that's not the case. You do have two priests, well, a bishop and a priest. And the priest doesn't have any lack of faith, at least not a lack of faith in God. He has a lack of faith in the devil. He doesn't believe in the devil, or he believes in it intellectually, but not emotionally. And so his lack of faith in the devil is what makes his engagement with this exorcism difficult. And throughout the whole story, there is a question of this: if this girl, the 16-year-old girl, is actually possessed or not. And it's much more open-ended than The Exorcist is, right? In The Exorcist, she is definitely clearly possessed. Not by the devil, but by a demon, right? And in this, it's open, right? There's much more room for interpretation because it's a psychological story. And I thought it was really, really well done. I enjoyed it. I like exorcism stories, except a lot of them are boring. Like, they follow a formula. And the ones that are able to break that formula in any way, I think, are really interesting and exciting. So I'm always looking for good material or good pop culture ideas of exorcism and, just ritual kind of occult horror that are playing with those stories that are exciting and fresh and new. And even though this is one of the first ones that was written in the West, it brought something to the table I hadn't seen before. So I appreciated it quite a lot. Moving on, the next book I want to talk about is Cuckoo by Gretchen Felker Martin. This, I had high expectations from this, just from the hype around it, and it didn't quite live up to those, yet I still really enjoyed it. The premise of this is, for me, and this is giving a little bit away, but not really. It's not giving away anything more that's in the copy. It's like a combination of John Carpenter's The Thing and It by Stephen King. So you follow characters in two timelines, as teenagers and then as adults. But unlike It, where those are interspersed back and forth, back and forth, back and forth, here it does the entire childhood timeline and then the adult timeline afterwards. So there's a clean break between the two. The childhood timeline is a bunch of queer kids who are sent to a conversion camp by really awful parents. And it is a really horrific, violent conversion camp. And there happen to be aliens that have infested that conversion camp. And that is the premise, right? Is these aliens that are trying to steal the skin or the faces or the bodies, the lives, the hearts of these queer kids. And then some of them escape, and then they go back. They decide they need to, end this presence once and for all and make it safe for other people. And so that's the story. And I thought it was fine. I think what I disliked about it was some of the narrative leaps. Like, obviously, it's a wild, gory, messy, really graphic sci-fi / dystopian horror novel, right? Well, I guess it's not that dystopian, unfortunately, because camps like this still exist, which is fucking terrifying. But some of the narrative of like how this alien came to Earth and like what its goal is and what its timeline is just very convoluted. Like, why is it doing things the way it's doing them? And that didn't add up. And they gave explanations for it in the story, but they just felt not particularly interesting. However, the story is very graphic. It's in your face. It has both sex and violence. And I thought it was a fun ride. Like, it was really entertaining. It doesn't have a lot of the deep kind of psychological trauma of these queer kids being terrified and tortured that you would expect. There's a lot of physical violence, but the kids never doubt who they are. And even though you have adult figures shaming them and calling them names and dead naming the trans characters and forcing them to, adopt gender presentations that are in line with what the adults think they should be, there are those things happening, which are traumatic and awful. But the kids themselves never doubt who they are. They never have any confusion about who they are. And once you bring in this non-human aspect, then it ceases about them fighting these awful humans who want to convert them to be normal again, quote unquote, and then it turns into fighting for their lives against this alien parasitic entity, and which is fun, right? It's engaging, and it's a metaphor for what it means to be, suppressed by the normalcy of the status quo. So it's not like there isn't, trauma at the heart of it, but it doesn't have like the psychological weight that other stories of this, queer horror often have. And so in that way, it's actually much gentler than a lot of queer horror that I've read, except that it's very gooey and violent and graphic. It's not extreme horror. Like, if you've read any extreme horror, or even splatterpunk, it's not that. But it goes close to that line, but it's not there. So your appreciation may vary. I will say I read I read a review looking up, as I was writing my review and thinking about it, I read one review that was really laudatory, but said, so many reviews like, this is so extreme. I don't know, maybe I'm just broken, but it's not that extreme. Like, it's slightly graphic, both in sex and violence, but not like extreme. And this review was like, it is so extreme that, I need to make it clear that not all queer horror is extreme like this. And because if straight people think that all queer horror is like this, then they won't ever read it. And I'm just like, good. Like, that's fine. Like, I don't think the author, Gretchen Felker Martin, has a problem with that, Okay, if this frightens off straight people, I don't think that's a problem. Though, straight people, you are welcome to come to the party. I don't think this will frighten you off. It is graphic, but not over the top. I don't know. Maybe I'm broken, but it didn't feel over the top to me. I enjoyed it. I thought the characters were unique, interesting. I enjoyed spending time with them. Thought they were fun. I think the narrative, like I said, it feels like there are plot holes that I wish had been filled in or had been given a little more consideration. But there's a lot of heart, there's a lot of emotion, and there is a lot of people fighting for what they believe in, even in the face of seemingly insurmountable odds. So I appreciated it. I thought it was a lot of fun. And I still haven't read her first novel. I have a copy of it, and I'm planning on reading it soon. I'd wanted to read it right after finishing this, but I'm trying to break the habit of giving into those impulses and just binge reading authors. So we'll see. Maybe by the end of the month, I'll have read it. Who knows? And then I have one book left that I want to discuss, and that is a recommendation, actually. Well, not a recommendation, but I saw Nick over at Dr. Cranky Pants Read. He talked about this book in his last wrap-up, I think it was. I will put a link down below. And I thought it sounded great, and I looked for it, and my library had it immediately available. So I listened to the audiobook of We All Want Impossible Things by Catherine Newman. And this is a wild left turn from everything else I have been talking about so far, but this is a very small story about a woman whose best friend is dying of cancer. And the story starts with her best friend entering hospice. And I think when Nick talked about this book, what he liked most about it, and I agree, is that Catherine Newman gives space for her characters to be messy. None of this is clean, right? No one knows how to do this correctly, and yet they're doing it the best they can. And there is a gentleness that all these characters are held in as they go through this most horrific part of their lives. And so I appreciated that. I have trained in hospice work. I've done hospice work. And I've done work at a hospital as a chaplain or a chaplain intern. So this is like a world that I live in. And then on top of that, if anyone has watched my channel for a while knows, my mother died last year in 2024 of breast cancer. And she lived with breast cancer for a little over a year, for like 15 months. And I returned to the States 3 different times for about 4 to 5 weeks each time to take care of her. So all of her end of life care I was doing. And it's interesting as someone who is trained in hospice work and trained in end of life care, both from a pragmatic my mother was a nurse, so I've grown up in nursing homes and in hospitals. So like the physicality of it is something I'm very used to, but also obviously the emotional and psychology of it I'm used to as well from my training. Providing end of life care for a loved one is much different than doing it professionally, in big part because my mother was not interested in any of my training, if that makes sense. Like, she didn't want to die. And any of the training, any of the comfort you can offer besides physical comfort, it's a two-way street, right? You can't offer comfort to someone who their only goal is to not die when they're very clearly dying. It's hard, right? It's really hard. And so I've gone through this from the inside and from the outside. And I think this book is a really gentle and introspective way to explore it. I will say, as far as someone dying of ovarian cancer goes, this book, everything is like the best you could possibly hope for. I think this is autofiction to some extent. I think reading the acknowledgments as well as dedication, that this is definitely an experience of the author's friend dying, I believe. And that was the inspiration for this. So, being cautious about what I say, not to be indelicate, but they find this really beautiful hospice that is like a B&B that's been converted to a hospice. It has really great staff, though I will say all the hospice staff I've ever met, whether it be doctors or nurses or other caregivers, have all been phenomenal, regardless of where they work or whatnot. But it's this really cute little B&B that's been transformed to a hospice and has wonderful staff. And the main character, who isn't the one dying, right? The main character is the friend of the one dying, is filled with a whole family that is supportive, and the dying woman as well has family that's supportive, and there's always people there to help. And there are many complications that can happen when someone is in end stage cancer, right? And very few of those happen, at least on the page. They might have happened as she was still fighting cancer before she entered hospice, but on the page, what happens is not nearly as messy as end of life can be. And at first, I had some thoughts about that because it's not an unrealistic portrayal of how some people die living with ovarian cancer and dying from ovarian cancer. It's not unrealistic that this happens the way it happened in this story with all of these support networks and so forth. But it isn't common that everything works out nearly as neatly as it does in this story. So I had thoughts about it. But as I read the story and as I sat with it, by having everything the best it could be, you still see how awful it is. And it gave space for our main character to really not have to navigate additional complications, but really focus on her own messy self and her inability to really grasp that her friend is dying and what that means for her, since her whole life has been tied up with this person, right? So while it does portray an idealized form of dying from ovarian cancer, that sounds awful, but that's what it does. You know, while I was in grad school, my mother's best friend died of ovarian cancer, and my mother also worked in Boston, or in Cambridge rather. Her best friend lived in Ohio, and while at the end of her life, my mother would fly to Ohio every weekend and spend the weekend with her best friend and her best friend's husband, and then fly back. And I always brought her to and from the airport and like decompressed and basically was providing emotional support and essentially therapy for my mother, which is not a healthy relationship for a parent and child to engage in, but it's what was needed. And her death was so awful. Like, ovarian cancer especially can be really, really awful and really messy, just really bad. And the character in this book doesn't go through that. And that's a blessing because it gives the other characters in the book space to grieve really monumentally, really have real grief, but not let the readers be complicated and think that that grief is born from these extra messy complications. The beauty of having the narrative play out the way it did is it gave space for the characters to be messy and overwhelmed and realize as readers that their experience is coming from the natural experience of living with someone who is dying. Do you know what I mean? And not from these additional complications and these additional kind of awful things that can happen when someone is dying from cancer. So, yeah, I don't know if I've sold you on the story, but it's really wonderful. It is really sweet. You're going to want to box tissues when you read it, and it's very manipulative in the way it plays with your emotions, and it's very clear. Like any story about someone dying is going to be manipulative, and it does it beautifully. Like it does everything really, really well. You feel, even though it is very clearly manipulating you, you feel held, right? You feel like you're safe as you explore this really difficult time. And that's, I think, the best you can ask for. So I really appreciate the recommendation from Nick. I'm really glad that he talked about it, and I'm glad I got a chance to read it as well. So that is We All Want Impossible Things by Catherine Newman. And that is it. That is all I have read so far in the first half of the month. What am I reading right now? I am currently reading 2.5 books, if that makes sense. I am reading 2 books that I have galleys for. First one is Night and Day. This is a collection of short stories edited by Ellen Datlow. It's a collection of short horror stories. And I'm going to be honest, the theme of Night and Day is not a great theme for any anthology of stories, but I think it's really just an excuse. This is being printed as a double, and so the first 9 stories, which are all under the theme of night, are one half of the book, and then you flip the book over upside down, and then the other half are day. I don't know, we'll see. I've only read 2 stories so far, and I've loved them. The first was by Clay McLeod Chapman, and the second was by Eric LaRocca, and I thought they were both great. And so I'm looking forward to continue reading this. I don't really think I'm all that impressed by the theme of Night and Day, but that's okay. I don't really care. Any anthology that has been edited by Ellen Datlow, I am down for. I'm also reading A Game in Yellow by Haley Piper. I literally just opened this today. This is inspired by The King in Yellow, which is a collection of short stories from the early, or rather the late 19th century. And in that collection of short stories, there is a play called The King in Yellow. And that play is like a cursed play or a forbidden play that induces madness in those who read it. And I haven't read that collection of short stories, I had meant to, but then I thought it'd be better to go into this blind because most people are going to read this blind. And so I know about that collection. I've heard about it before, but I haven't read it. But that somehow plays a role in the mythology of this story. So we'll see how it goes. I really like Haley Piper. Everything I've read by her, I've been really impressed by. Even the ones that haven't been my favorite, I've still been really impressed by her writing and the depth of her character work and the kind of ingenuity in the way she writes. So I'm looking forward to that. And then the other thing, I have an audiobook going right now that, again, I just received it this morning, and that is Tehanu. This is the 4th book in the Earthsea cycle by Ursula K. Le Guin. So I'm going to be reading that. So those are the 3 books I'm reading right now, and I don't have anything else coming up for the rest of the month. That's not true. I want to read The Golden Fool, which is the next book in the Tawny Man trilogy, as I mentioned. But other than that, I don't have any plans. I'm sure I'll read another book by Adrian Tchaikovsky, maybe another arc. I'm trying to get through all of the arcs that I have because I don't like the feeling of them weighing me down. And none of them are up for publication until I think September or October, but I'd like to read some of them now. That way I don't feel stressed out by them because they stress me out, which is my own fault because I'm the one that requests them. So I'll probably read some of those. And I want to read more horror. I've been reading a lot of fantasy and sci-fi, which I've been loving, but I feel like I need more horror in my life. I just recently looked at my story graph for the year, and I think I've read 120 books so far, and more than half of that is horror, and then sci-fi and fantasy each fill up basically half of what's left, but that's not enough. So that is my plan for the rest of the month. And I think that's it. This has gone on long enough, so I will say thank you for spending so long with me today. If you have any thoughts about any of the books I mentioned, I'd love to hear them down below in the comments. If you have any suggestions for other books, things you think I'd like to read second half of the month, anything at all you want to say, I'd love to hear it down below. For now, I'll say thank you for spending some time with me today. I appreciate you. Please be kind to yourselves, take care of each other, and go slowly.